research showing that the percentage of people who have antibodies in South Africa to fight COVID-19 is now very high in our society. The numbers come from the South African National Blood Service. It's been looking at the blood that's given by blood donors. Marion Vermeulen is the Executive for Transfusion Medicine and Technical Services at the South African National Blood Service. Marion, good afternoon to you. What percentage of blood donors that you've received blood from actually have these COVID-19 antibodies?
So good afternoon and welcome to your listeners and to your viewers. We've done a number of surveys. This is not the first survey, and we performed a survey between January and May last year, and in that survey of blood donors, we found around about 35% of blood donors had antibodies, which we extrapolated then into the general population to around about 47%. And that survey was done after the beta variant had occurred, but prior to the Delta variant happening. This last survey that we did was samples that we collected in November, before we actually even knew about Omicron, but we did know that there was going to be another wave happening, and so which is why we collected samples pre that wave. And in that wave, 55% actually of the blood donors tested positive. And when that was extrapolated back into the general population using some weighting, we estimate around about 71% of people in the general population have probably already had SARS-CoV-2.
Do you find big differences between donors from different parts of our society?
So in the first study back in January to May last year, yes, we did. We found in that study that the highest rate was in the Eastern Cape, with much lower rates in, for example, the Northern Cape and the Western Cape. In this last study in November, those numbers have all evened out, and I think that's where you can see that those provinces that had high antibody levels. Obviously, there was some protection, and so they didn't increase that much more, whereas those provinces that had very low levels of antibodies, people got infected, and now those numbers are almost all the same. So everyone's ranging somewhere between sort of 65 and 75, 80%. It's all relatively close now.
If I've understood some of the reporting on this and some of the documentation that you've provided correctly, some of the epidemiologists have also found what seem to be quite big differences between the percentage of black people who donated blood, the percentage of they who have antibodies, and the percentage of white people who donated blood. And that it seems some groups of people have been more exposed to the virus than others.
Yes, and so that is one of the, in fact, it's the only difference that we see now in the November survey. But we saw that same difference also in the January to May survey. So we are still seeing quite a significant difference between our black donors and our white donors. And I think that is possibly due to not being able to social distance as easily, potentially, as in more upper class or middle class areas. So yes, I do think that's the reasons for that.
So when we have a figure that shows we have such a high, I don't know, is the right phrase, prevalence rate of antibodies, does it mean all the people who have these antibodies are probably have quite good protection against the variants of COVID that we've had up until now?
So there's definitely some protection. We know now after Omicron that even with that high level, so at 71%, we were still seeing quite a number of reinfections. Many people who'd been infected before got infected again. So it doesn't provide 100% protection, not at all. But it is definitely providing some protection, and it does definitely seem to be providing protection against severity of illness and hospitalization and death, which is, of course, what you want. So, yes, I think this level of antibody, or prevalence of antibodies in our population is good news.
There's also another question, and I don't even know if you're able to tell the difference here. I don't know how big the machines you have are to analyze blood. I imagine they're probably bigger than this room. But are you able to tell the difference between the blood, or between the people who have immunity from vaccinations, or the people who have antibodies from being vaccinated, and the people who have antibodies because they've been exposed to the virus?
So yes, that is possible. So first of all, what's not possible is if somebody has been exposed to the virus and has been vaccinated, then we can only tell that they've been exposed. We can't actually tell that they've also been vaccinated. But if somebody has and in this study with the studies that we've done up until now, we have not done any of the tests that detect for vaccine only. So we know that all of these people in this study are all people who have actually been exposed. But it is possible. Our next study that we want to do, actually, we will test our blood donors in 2 different tests. So the one test tests for anti-spike, and so people who have been vaccinated and have been exposed would test positive on that test. And then those samples you then would test again on another test, which is called an anti-nuclear capsid, and only people who have been exposed would test positive on that test. So you would then be able to differentiate to say these people were vaccinated only, these people were exposed and could or could not have been vaccinated.
It's really interesting. It's very important research that you're doing. I know there are other seroprevalence surveys out there. Is there a concern that there might be an urban bias with the blood that you get? In other words, there'll be some parts of the country you don't really get blood from, or is that not such a concern?
It is a concern. So it's not necessarily an urban bias. We do go all over the country, but blood donors are not totally generalizable to the general population. And we know this, and also on top of that, there's what's known as a healthy donor effect as well, just because of all the other screening that gets done, when you go to donate blood pressure and all those kind of things as well. So we know that it's not fully generalizable. What we did in these studies is we looked to see if we could find any differences. We didn't see any difference, for example, in age. We didn't see any difference in gender. And now in this last study, we didn't even see any difference in province, or not significant. And so what we did, we know that our blood donors' race proportions is not totally generalizable also to the general population. And so we weighted the extrapolation into the general population by race group, so for it to be more generalizable. But that is definitely a limitation that must be taken. It must be considered.
Marion Vermeulen, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating research. The Executive for Transfusion Medicine and Technical Services at the South African National Blood Service.